In any case, it's important to stress, as one of the authors of the Black Book of Communism ironically recognizes, the need for the contextualization of Bolshevik political violence at first, and Stalin's violence later on, within the long duration of Russian history. It's important not to lose sight of Stalinism's matrix, which was the First World War, the revolutions of 1917, and the civil wars as a whole. 385 and therefore, emerging when no one could yet predict Stalin's rise to power, and even before the Bolshevik Revolution, Stalinism isn't the result of an ideology or an individual's thirst for power, but more precisely the result of the permanent state of emergency which consumes Russia in 1914. As we've seen, from the start of the 19th century a number of very different personalities didn't miss the troubling signs of a gathering storm over the country that sits between Europe and Asia. The storm manifests itself in all its violence with the outbreak of the First World War. One must start from here, and from the incredibly long duration of the Second Time of Troubles. It's not by chance that we're dealing with a phenomenon that unfolds in a totally non-linear manner. We see it ease in moments of relative normalization, and we see it manifest in all its severity when the state of emergency reaches its zenith. Let's start with a preliminary question. At what point could we refer to Soviet Russia as a personal and absolute dictatorship? Respectable historians appear to be in agreement on an essential point. At the start of the 1930s, Stalin was not yet an autocrat. He was not free from criticism, dissension, and authentic opposition within the Communist Party. The absolute power of a leader shielded by a cult of personality had not yet emerged. The Leninist tradition of the dictatorship of the party and oligarchic power persisted. 386 The historian cited here used the two terms interchangeably. By all measures the second poorly describes a regime that encourages an incredibly strong level of social mobility for the subaltern classes and that opens political and cultural life to social strata and ethnic groups that were totally marginalized up until then. It seems evident that, at least starting from 1937, and starting with the outbreak of the Great Terror, the dictatorship of the party gives way to autocracy. Should we then identify two phases within Stalinism? Despite questioning the traditionally monolithic interpretation, this periodization doesn't represent a genuine step forward in the comprehension of those years. In any case, the transition from the first phase to the second, and the concrete configuration of both, require explanation. To understand the problem, let's see what happened in the middle of the 1920s. At a time in which, having survived the severe crisis represented by foreign intervention and civil war, NEP has achieved significant results. Not only is there no autocracy, but despite the Communist Party's continued dictatorship, the management of power tends to become more liberal. Bukharin appears to go as far as encouraging a rule of law, of sorts. The peasantry should have before them Soviet order, Soviet rights, Soviet legality and not arbitrary Soviet authority moderated by a complaints office whose location is unknown. Solid legal norms are required, obligatory for communists as well. The state must now commit itself to peaceful organizing work, and the party, in its relations with the masses, must apply persuasion and only persuasion. Terror no longer makes sense, it now belongs to the past. 387 In its place, the task is making space for the initiative of the masses. In this context, it's necessary to look positively on the flourishing of popular associations and voluntary organizations. 388 Before us are not merely personal opinions. These are the years of the Duumvirate. 389 Bukharin manages power alongside Stalin, who in 1925 constantly seeks the liquidation of the remnants of war communism in the countryside and condemns the deviation which denounces an imaginary restoration of capitalism and risks inciting the class struggle in rural areas and civil war in our country. 390 They must realize that we are in the phase of economic development. 391 The shift in emphasis from the class struggle to economic development carries important consequences for the political sphere as well. The primary responsibility for communist students is to become masters of science. 392 Only this way can they aspire to carry out a leadership role. Competence matters, solid, practical management is now required. And therefore, to truly lead it's necessary to understand your own work, it's necessary to study it conscientiously, patiently, and with perseverance. 393 The centrality of economic development, and therefore of competence, makes the party monopoly less rigid. It's critical that a communist act as an equal to those outside the party, especially because the control of party members over the work of those outside the party could produce very positive results. 394 Overall, a radical political change is unavoidable according to Stalin. Today it's no longer possible to lead through military methods. It's not maximum pressure that's needed now but maximum flexibility, both in policy and in organization. Maximum flexibility in both policy direction as in organizational management. What's needed is dedication in receptively capturing the aspirations and needs of the workers and peasants. And with respect to the peasants, who often prove to be more backward than the workers, the task of communists and cadres is to learn how to convince them, sparing neither time nor effort for this purpose. 395 It's not just a matter of embracing a more sophisticated political pedagogy. What's necessary is doing away with merely formal elections conducted from above, and bad practices which included lack of rigor, abuse of power, and arbitrary behavior by administrators. A radical shift is required. The old electoral practices were a remnant of war communism which should be liquidated as a harmful practice, rotten from top to bottom. 396 Now it's a matter of reactivating the Soviets, transforming the Soviets into true elected bodies, and establishing in rural areas the principles of Soviet democracy. 397 Even before October, the Soviets had started to transform into bureaucratic structures, with an observable decrease in the frequency and consistency of the assemblies. 398 But now, return to their original function. The Soviets are called upon to guarantee the participation of the workers in the daily work of state administration. 399 How does this take place? Quote, it takes place through organizations based on mass initiative, all kinds of commissions and committees, conferences and delegate meetings that spring up around the Soviets, economic bodies, factory committees, cultural institutions, party organizations, youth league organizations, all kinds of cooperative associations, and so on and so forth. Our comrades sometimes fail to see that around the low units of our party, Soviet, cultural, trade union, educational, YCL and army organizations, around the departments for work among women and all other kinds of organizations, there are whole teeming anthills, organizations, commissions and conferences which have sprung up of their own accord and embrace millions of non-party workers and peasants, anthills which, by their daily, inconspicuous, painstaking, quiet work, provide the basis and the life of the Soviets, the source of strength of the Soviet state. 400 unquote. For all these reasons, it's wrong to identify the party with the state. Moreover, to do so is a distortion of Lenin's thinking. Further, once the position of the new state is consolidated, both internally and internationally, it's necessary to extend the constitution to the entire population, including the bourgeoisie. 401 At this moment, taking up some of the formulations used by Marx to celebrate the Paris Commune, Stalin takes an interest in the idea of the reduction and even the withering away of the state apparatus. The revitalization of the Soviets and political participation could be a step in that direction. It's a matter of transforming our state apparatus, linking it to the popular masses, and making it sound and honest, simple and inexpensive. 402 On top of this, Associations that emerge from civil society should be encouraged. They unite the Soviets with the rank and file, they merge the state apparatus with the vast masses and, step by step, destroy everything that serves as a barrier between the state apparatus and the people. 403 In conclusion, the dictatorship of the proletariat is not an end in itself. The dictatorship is a means, a way of achieving socialism. But what is socialism? Socialism is the transition from a society with the dictatorship of the proletariat to a stateless society. 404 What's on the agenda is certainly not the end of the dictatorship of the proletariat and the party, but rather their evident moderation. This political openness shared by Bukharin and Stalin, but classified by the followers of Zinoviev as Bolshevism of the middle peasantry. 405 was followed by the crisis which leads to the liquidation of NEP, the coerced collectivization of agriculture and industrialization in forced stages, with a subsequent expansion of the Universitätskonzentration. What determines the change isn't, as is often claimed, the ideological zealotry of the leadership group, that is, the obsession with eliminating the market and all forms of private property. At the same time, one can't underestimate the pressure from below, in not unimportant sectors of society. Nostalgia for the egalitarianism from before the introduction of NEP remains strong. Moreover, another factor comes into play. As if wanting to respond to the sort of analysis that's widespread today, on November 19, 1928, Stalin states that the Soviet Union is led by sober and calm people, concerned with the problem of how to defend the independence of a country significantly more backward compared to the hostile powers that encircle it. 406 Thus, they are driven by their concern over the international situation, an international situation seen as increasingly hostile. At the end of November 1925, the Treaty of Locarno was signed. Drawing France and Germany closer together, it mended relations between the Western powers that had fought each other during the First World War, thus formalizing the USSR's isolation. It's not hard to find voices seeking a European crusade against communism. 407 And in Moscow, top-level figures like Zinoviev, Roddick, and Kamenev dramatically stress the rising risk of an invasion. 408 Months later, the coup d'état in Poland marks Pilsudski's rise to power, a declared enemy of the Soviet Union. In his office the painting of Napoleon crossing the Alps is prominently displayed, but Pilsudski admires him for his invasion of Russia. That last endeavor had Polish participation. The new strongman in Warsaw recalls this with pride, and hopes to take Ukraine from the USSR in order to make it a subaltern and loyal ally. 409 On August 24, 1926, Pilsudski rejected the proposal made by Moscow for a non-aggression treaty, and later the Soviet Minister of Foreign Affairs denounces Polish plans aimed at acquiring a protectorate in the Baltics. The following year, the international situation became even more ominous. Great Britain cuts off commercial and diplomatic relations with the USSR, and Marshal Ferdinand Foch encouraged France to do the same. In Beijing, the USSR's embassy suffers an attack by the troops of Chiang Kai-shek, egged on from London perhaps, while in Warsaw the Soviet ambassador is assassinated by a White Russian émigré. Finally, in Leningrad there's an explosion at the headquarters of the Communist Party. At this point, it's Tukhachevsky, the Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces, who sounds the alarm and demands a rapid modernization of the military. NEP no longer seems capable of solving the problem. Yes, the economy shows signs of recovery, and in 1926 to 1927 it returns to pre-war levels, but, with respect to industrial production and technology, the distance between the USSR and the most advanced capitalist countries remains the same. Incisive or even drastic measures are unavoidable. 410 And the military presses for similar measures in agriculture, with the aim of guaranteeing a regular food supply for the front line. As you can see, the policy shift in 1929 isn't the result of Stalin's impulsiveness, who in fact must, if not contain, at least channel the pressure coming from the military, in rejecting the unrealistic objectives demanded mainly by Tukhachevsky. Stalin warns against red militarism which, in concentrating exclusively on the arms industry, would run the risk of jeopardizing economic development, and ultimately jeopardizing military modernization altogether. 411 Nor is the policy shift the result of a rigid ideology, aside from the power of the Communist Party and the prevailing social relations within the USSR. What's at stake is the existence of the nation. This is the opinion of a large part of the Soviet leadership group, beginning with Stalin, of course. The state of alarm appears all the more justified by the ominous international horizon, both in the diplomatic sphere and in the economic sphere, and on top of this there's the grain crisis within Russia. Lines to acquire food become widespread in the cities, provoking a deterioration of the crisis. It was a situation that could only work against Bukharin's policy aims. Bukharin's biographer correctly observes. 412 At this point the Duumvirat's fate is sealed. The rupture isn't just explained by the moral scruples of the defeated member of the Duumvirat, who astutely foresees the St. Bartholomew's Night caused by the forced collectivization of agriculture. What causes the internal split is chiefly another factor. Bukharin is also worried about the risk of war, but he doesn't believe that a solution can be found just within the national context. Socialism's definitive victory in our country isn't possible without the help of other countries and the world revolution. 413 The Bolshevik leader, who had previously condemned the Brest-Litovsk Treaty as a cowardly and nationalistic desertion from the international struggle of the proletariat, remains loyal to that vision of internationalism. Quote, if we exaggerate our possibilities, there then could arise a tendency to spit on the international revolution. Such a tendency could give rise to its own special ideology, a peculiar national Bolshevism or something else in this spirit. From here it is a few small steps to a number of even more harmful ideas. 414 Unquote. Stalin, however, more realistically works off the premise that the capitalist world has stabilized. The defense of the USSR is primarily a national task. It's not just a matter of advancing the country's industrialization through forced stages. As the grain crisis showed, the flow of food from the countryside into the cities and the army is by no means guaranteed. Especially sensitive to this problem was someone like Stalin who, beginning with his rich experience from the Civil War, had often stressed the key importance of stability in the rear and of the food supplies coming from the countryside. Here are the conclusions found in a letter to Lenin and in an interview with Pravda, from summer and autumn of 1918. The question of food supplies is naturally tied to the military question. In other words, an army can't sustain itself for very long without a stable rear. For the front to remain stable, it's crucial that the army regularly receives supplies, military provisions and food from the rear. 415 In the lead up to Hitler's invasion, Stalin gives great attention to agriculture, considering it a central element of national defense. 416 One can then understand why, at the end of the 1920s, collectivization of agriculture seemed to be the mandatory route in order to significantly accelerate the country's industrialization and to secure the stable supply of provisions needed by the cities and the army, all in preparation for war. In effect, quote, putting aside the human costs, the economic results of the first five-year plan were stunning. Increasing industrial production by 250%, Soviet Russia took colossal steps in becoming a major industrial power. Obviously, the great leap forward in Soviet Russia's industrial economy brought with it a great leap forward for the arms industry, with military spending increasing by a factor of 5 between 1929 and 1940.417 unquote. More modest are the results achieved in agriculture. Nevertheless, Centralization and the decline of subsistence farming create more favorable conditions for a large army's regular provision.